Thanks, Mr. Speaker. We want to say that people don't choose through which belief and in which state to be born. We believe that religion in the status quo is exclusive in a way that it excludes certain members of the society and creates hierarchies where one religion seems dominant in the society. So we believe that the state should end all the support to religion in order to alleviate all those issues. So our mechanism is simple. Firstly, we won't support any religion and we won't provide any funding to the religion. And second of all, the money that's going to be spent into religion will be redistributed into things like healthcare and etc. So on that, I'll have two things in this speech. Firstly, I'll explain you why principally state shouldn't support any belief and about people don't giving any consent to the state to provide those fundings. And second of all, I'll explain the practical outcomes of supporting religion and how we change that on our side of the house. So firstly, beginning with principle. We believe that state is the collection of individuals that pay taxes and contribute to the state equally. We say that state, that's why should remain a neutral actor that doesn't take any position with regards to the identities or the beliefs of the person. We say that supporting a religion is undergoing, first of all, undergone opportunities on things like healthcare, the basic duty of the state to promote things. But second of all, we say that identity is very personal. People don't give any consent to the state for the tax money to spend there, and unfortunately people cannot opt out of this environment and of this system. Because often religion is not debated in things like political debates, and because state funds religion for its own political and electoral gains in order to fight the votes out of these people. So the incentive to start a discussion is missed on their side of the house. But furthermore, we say that most of the funding is spent in order to sustain the dominant religion. Religious organizations like South Korea actually funds the Christian church. Why? Because first of all, we say that these religious institutions have the biggest political capital. They have the critical mass, they have a huge people that support that religious ideology. But moreover, we say that parties have an interest to have their own political interest to vote gain to gain certain votes. They appeal to the majority of the electorate, which support that party. For instance, the U.S. government supporting the Republican Party, which states and claims to its followers that the Republican Party is the God's party. These kind of things create an actual incentive for the state to support the religion. So what are the impacts? We say that state legitimizes the core and dominant religion inside of that country. Why? Because we say that sending money is not only financially supporting a certain thing, but it's also accepting the core ideology that lies behind an issue and actively supporting that. It says that state accepts to sustain that ideology and that belief. It sends a message that this is the powerful one and this maybe a bit later, and that the state is the collection of society and which supports that ideology. Furthermore, it creates hierarchies inside of that society, which means that the members of the minority religion feel threatened when they see that the huge majority of the support is undergone to that dominant religious ideology. They will think that the state doesn't support that. But second of all, we say that most of the religions are inaccessible. We say that religion is a collective of doctrines that are hugely conservative, and it has an exclusive membership only when you do all of the accept all of the doctrines, only then you can enter. That's why in the status quo, most gay people cannot access the religious purity simply for those exclusive characteristics. Thus, we say that it's very principle abhorrent that if I pay for the taxes and cannot access those religious things and beliefs, that the state supports it's unjust towards me and it constrains people, and that's hugely illegitimate. But before going to practical outcomes, closing.
Do you think there is something unique about the benefits religion gives its followers that cannot be replicated?
Yeah, I'll talk about some practical outcomes. So secondly, talking about the practical outcomes. We've already done a bit of some part of that, but we also say that supporting certain religious ideology creates communities that are hugely conservative. These communities tend to be conservative for two reasons. First of all, because they are bound with scriptures and plagues and imams of certain Muslim communities in the status quo already hugely appeal to those scriptures in legitimizing their religion. But second of all, these things are controlled by people who are deeply conservative and who perpetuate other conservative people in order to use that power in supporting that ideology. For instance, that's why actually imams in most countries are conservative. What are the unique harms? First, we say that it constrains the people's choices. For instance, that's when certain religion internalizes the ideology to the value that abortion is sin, then if, for instance, I want to make abortion, it always comes to my mind that this dominant religion promoted that issue. It makes me feel very uncomfortable and creates huge psychological distresses. And crucially, people cannot opt out of this environment because religious doctrines are discussed on every place, like media, relatives, communities, and etc. That's hugely disproportionate harm. But how we change all of the situation on outside of the house? We say that religion in the status future will have to adapt to social change in order to economically develop themselves. Like financial support is very crucial for religious institutions in order to support, for instance, mosques and gain other followers in order to promote the core ideology of the religion. But in the status quo, when they take money from the state, they can define it in a way that they want, in a way that's mostly reliable to them, in order to promote those very powerful and conservative ideology. But in comparative, we say that this religious ideology is more likely to be inclusive because it has to change as community wants them to change in order to gain an economic benefit and the support from the people in order to sustain their own religious ideology. That's why in the status future on outside of the house, you are going to see the religion that's more inclusive and that's more comfortable even to the minorities. And for those reasons, I'm very proud to propose. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the leader of opposition.
In trying times, religion provides comfort to the poor, to the sick, to the elderly. It provides community. It provides an understanding of the uncertainty and desperate, quiet agony that a world in which we can't know our exact purpose constrains us from. And yes, sometimes that might be slightly politically conservative, but given that this opposition team's first 5 minutes was about how it is bad for the government to weigh in on ideological clashes, it is not obvious to me how an ideology that individuals themselves opt into is something that is so problematic. I'm going to make 2 arguments in this speech. The first is why, in principle, the government should support the existence of religions, or at least the specific things that religions do should not be subject to government imposition. And secondly, I'll describe why you make religions worse, more inward-looking, and to a degree, more damaging to their membership. In terms of what we support in this debate, we believe there should be limited criteria placed on religions in order for them to access non-profit status. First, there must be a non-profit. That is to say, the televangelism shown in that information video is obviously unacceptable. You should not be allowed to make money in that way. That is very noticeable, given that these people have large property portfolios themselves. Secondly, it shouldn't function as a liability shield for you. That is to say, if you are the leader of a large organisation, you claim to make claims on the basis of things. If harms that accrue to other people you're legally liable for, you should be the one to suffer the consequences. We support a couple of kinds of government support that already exist largely across the West and to a limited degree in other countries as well. The first and most obvious are tax breaks. That is to say, we are not taxing these organisations because they are non-for-profit, they are registered as charities. And secondly, equal access to applications for sorts of charitable grants. So if you want to have a, Pentecostal homelessness drive, then you should be able to access government support for that. Critically, we believe that should be done for all religions. Equally, the opposition, and this is my first point of rebuttal, says you can't do that because in majoritarian communities, one religion has more political capital than the others. Well, that then begs the question of the debate, right? If the reason that only one religion is given realistic support is because there is only enough political capital to do that, then there is absolutely not enough political capital for the opposition to abolish what has already arisen from that political capital distribution, which is the unequal degree of that support. We believe it is much easier in this debate to say we will continue to give you that access on the condition that other religions also get access to that, given that it comes at no cost to those majority religions. We think they'll be comfortable for that. And at that point, most of their harms about how either this encourages people towards one religion that they did not choose that gets disproportionate power, or it sends a message that the state supports one thing over another, are not actually important in this debate because we're able to have that degree of state support. Firstly, why should they not pay tax? More things to say here. The first is that most revenue is raised from the donations of ordinary members of the religious community who already paid income tax on that money and who often have already paid other forms of taxes like goods and services tax or sales taxes. Insofar as that is true, this is a private expenditure for things that they find valuable in their personal lives and should not be subject to double taxation. It should rather be allowed to carry out the function that those religious members wanted to have. The second thing to say is that they are not for profit. That is to say, the principle of charity works here. You only pay tax when you are aiming to not provide assistance, when you're aiming to provide assistance to other people to benefit yourself. But that is not what is happening here. You are providing benefits to other people at no advantage to yourself. And in that context, it is wrong for the government to stick its hand in and take a slice of the pie when you're not benefiting from it. That's the difference between corporate tax, where other people are advantaging, and charitable taxes, where you are only doing good for other people in the community. Even if that good is subjectively defined by giving them access to religious goods, the subjectivity is not the important thing, it's about the intent of the individual person. Let me decide whether or not they should be making a contribution. Thirdly, they're relatively insulated from state infrastructure. That is to say, they own their own facilities, they have their own membership bases, they do not require state support. In the same way, for instance, workforces require the government to educate people so they have good employees. But religions do not require many of those things, which means they relatively owe the state less of a reciprocal obligation. And finally, it helps the state. That is to say, religious organizations do many good works that I'll describe in a moment for you, and in that sense, the government, if anything, owes them an obligation. And critically, that first argument indicates that the specific form of financial support that we describe in this debate, which is the tax breaks, is important. The government has no right to tax these organizations. It would be wrong for them to do so and damage their standing. But secondly, why is religion good? The first is the one that I described in my introduction. The world is a profoundly uncertain and difficult place because we do not know exactly why we are here. We often don't have useful, good frameworks or rubrics for discovering meaning or discovering how to deal with tough times. Religions provide people a framework with which to do that. And that is true of religion. Religious organizations provide them the interpreters that help them get there. That is to say, the organizational leader is the one who can explain it to you, hold your hand, explain to you why religion is still true and still important. Yep.
So can you explain to us why without the government funding or this kind of religious organization will die or will find no this kind of end or not?
The first thing to say is that the opening government's case is contingent on the idea that this massively changes their incentives because they require capital. That is why the opening government's argument about how they will need to get more progressive to expand their membership base is true. The second thing is, it is a relatively trivial premise of economics. If you tax something at a higher rate, the prevalence of it goes down. Firstly, because the incentive to provide it declines. Secondly, because the capacity to provide it declines. Because, for instance, you need to have fewer physical locations or fewer staff members providing it. It seems pretty intuitive to me. I really hope that's not your extension. Secondly, on good works in this debate, that is to say, these organisations provide an awful lot of charity for three reasons. Firstly, because there is an internalised belief about religion that it is important for you to provide charity. Secondly, because it is widely perceived as important to the legitimacy of these organisations that they provide charity to other people. And thirdly, because it's a good way to utilise the incredibly enthusiastic and keen workforce. And that means that often religious organisations are incredibly good at providing charity. A great example is the American state of Utah, in which has the lowest homelessness rate in the United States because the LDS Church is incredibly large and effective at delivering meaningful service support to these people. And the third one is one I described in my introduction as well. For many elderly people, lively church and social networks are the only social network that they have in a context in which literally they've lost contact with or a lot of their friends have died. Discouraging that incredibly important form of social good is so problematic. Finally, how does this change religion? This leads to a decline in the rate of religion for the reasons that I've already described to you, particularly amongst people who probably would get benefits out of the religion. Because if your reason for not being in the religion is because the church did not proselytize to you, or because you saw the church and it was really disgusting and not poorly upkept, you might have benefited a lot from that, and it's regrettable that you missed out. But the worst incentive in this debate is that the easiest way for these religions to keep their money and keep the financial status that they're used to is for them to abuse members who are inelastic. That is to say, people who are older, people who have been in the religion for a very long period of time. Those are the people who the church likes to treat well because they're good people. But when push comes to shove and they're faced with an existential threat, it's very easy to begin preaching fire and brimstone, saying you need to donate far more to us. And that means that this is actually not a tax on churches. It is a tax on vulnerable elderly people who do not feel comfortable leaving the church. And that is the thing that God would be most ashamed of.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
What we can have in an open government is the fact that some donations that these churches operate usually are the specific donations that they have can be, for example, tax exempt, or the specific donations the churches provide to other organizations might be tax exempt at the point in which you make that spending. We say that that is not extremely important in this debate, because at the point in which, for example, you give as a rich person money to a certain charity that is actually the intermediary that provides people, the poor support, we say that you can tax exempt that spending. That is specifically what happens in the status quo, and that is what we can do with the church. They haven't provided, the opening opposition hasn't provided the exact reason as to why churches are the best ones to deliver that service. We say that at the point in which the amount of donations doesn't change, we say that we don't actually see what's the comparative change in terms of the amount of poor people that will be provided with care. We think that is important. What they also missed in this debate is the fact that, for example, you have the provision of facilities in certain countries where it actually provides not just the tax breaks to these communities, but we say that yes, we will not provide tax breaks for the creation of facilities in certain places. We will also not provide support and aid to those communities. We say that is what the most important thing is the debate, not about the charity. So we also say that at the point in which they say, well, they pay double taxation, that the people who pay that money is already double taxation. But that applies to all organizations, like every organization that you have is there, you have already paid an income tax on that. We think that by that logic, you can't have taxation of any sort of organization that is providing any sort of good, and if they, by that logic, even the most disgusting things, you can say, well, that should be tax exempt, that should be not provided with that analysis. We say that at the point in which it is damaging to certain people and it excludes certain people from the public sphere that it operates in, the state shouldn't be providing that support. They also say, look, it is not the subjective fact, it is only the intent that matters. We say that, no, it is not. We say that by that logic, you can say that the people who are thinking that they are providing help to the community because they're eliminating people who because of their sexuality, we say that no, the intent doesn't matter. The subjective fact of the threat that person feels at that particular point in time where he's bound by that religious doctrine is what matters in this debate, and that is completely something that opening opposition completely ignores in this debate. What they also say is that it provides social networks to the elderly people. And we completely agree with that. And if we're talking about this small churches will lose support, we say that two things might happen. Firstly, they might become more inclusive at the point in which they depend on the majority of people, and they will not just depend on the elderly people, which they characterize as socially vulnerable. We don't understand the comparative change, and at the point in which that is extremely something most important to those vulnerable people, they're already donating the vast majority of their capital. But secondly, at the point in which they don't have that money, we say that now that churches is becoming to be more inclusive, and and it's becoming that is precisely our case. But we also say that on the alternative, they haven't explained to us the reasons why these older people are actually engaging in those communities. And the reason for why it's true is because the state has no incentive to provide other kinds of communities at the point in which they already provide tax breaks to church. So we can provide them with like a secular social community that they have. They don't provide us reasons as to why that community is specifically bound by religious doctrine that makes it possible. We say that it can exist in other places. We can provide other communities with that kind of network. We say that the comparative change isn't important in this debate. But what opening opposition has completely... okay,
there are many things the government spends money on which only impact specific communities or specific kinds of people, not everyone. Are you opposed to all sorts of specific spending the government involves?
Yes. So the crucial thing in this debate is that the fact that all of those spending that you have are, you can hold those organizations or you can hold that specific spending into account. At the point in which you actually provide social welfare to people, you can say, well, look, you shouldn't be providing that, you shouldn't exclude certain people, and that is why we're going to fine you. At the point in which religion actually is able, and the core of the religion is that it has certain religious doctrines and it can exclude that minority. It is precisely what it depends on. We say that it is bad that that you cannot hold that to accountable and have a change inside of that community. Opposition cannot say that government support at any point incentivizes those communities to change, because we cannot force them to change in any meaningful way as a state. So what do we say on our side of the house? Firstly, we say that the important thing that opening opposition hasn't engaged is the fact that that it threatens certain minorities. They think, well, look, it is a choice and you can opt in. We say that that's completely not true. At the point in which you are born in a certain community that has a small congregation of people, the people who you communicate on a daily basis with every day are thinking with that specific ideology. And the church has a power of propaganda. The church has a power of propagating certain values in that specific society. We say that at the point in which those values are exclusive and harmful to those people, the state shouldn't be able to support them. So we say that when you are that minority and when you feel that you, for example, you internalize that notion that, look, as a gay person, you feel uncomfortable, and they say, look, it is a choice. We say that when you say you will go to hell or don't embrace your identity, it is not a choice that you can easily opt in and out from. We say that what we change on this side of the house is two things. Firstly, it means that... no, thank you. It means that firstly, as I already explained, the incentives change, and that means that those religious doctrines change, and these people feel more comfortable with. Secondly, what changes is that even if they don't change specifically, and even if they don't change the doctrines, it means that they are less likely to advocate in the public sphere. At the point in which 90% of people are supporting like birth control bills, they are not likely to advocate in public sphere. What that means is that those people with various identities are able now to embrace the specific benefits that closing opposition argue about. But thirdly, what changes is that you don't provide, at the very least, you don't provide the legitimization to that community. When you look at this televangelism, the individuals whose identities are exclusive to those, they don't feel threatened by the fact, because we think they are fringe, crazy ideologies that have nothing to do with the state. At the point in which you support the state and you give them the society's legitimacy, that means that you are far more fearing of that. The reason why this is precisely extremely important in this debate, because if you can't access those communities and you are unable to embrace that specific benefit, the point in which your taxes and your money is being spent on that is bad. It is irrespectively bad of all the benefits that closing opposition will talk about. Because even if it provides good for some people, it doesn't provide good for me, and the individual's life and experiences are what the most important thing we're very proud of.
Thank you, Speaker, and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
opening government says they are for state neutrality. That belies the second half of their case, where they spend their time telling you why we should effectively try to punish religions for the sin of being conservative. It is not coherent to use your progressive ideology as an excuse to crack down on institutions due to their conservatism alone. Three areas of this debate. First, the principle and the way in which the state should regard religion. Second of all, the effect on the behaviour of religions. And third, the value judgment on whether it is appropriate to treat organisations that do good in this particular way. So, on the principle, they tell us that the harm of this is it will entrench the funding of dominant groups, which is not a reason to institute this particular topic, because we can support, obviously, the provision of funding and support to religions in a way that is neutral between the religion and the particular state, which would require less political capital than this policy. They tell us it would involve endorsing an ideology of a particular religion. That is maybe true in a very minimal sense, because it says that that ideology is an ideology that meets our criteria for being a legitimate non-profit organisation, but is not true beyond that, in much the same way that when the state provides funding to political parties, it does not endorse a particular ideology of one of those parties, or arts funding, it does not endorse the value of a particular film, or infrastructure project, not endorsing what occurs and how the infrastructure is used. So we do not think this involves the state having to become a Catholic state when it funds a Catholic church. They tell us that this is unjustified because these religions are inaccessible. They do very little work to explain precisely what barriers prevent somebody accessing a religion, apart from asserting that you are born into a particular community and apparently no one could opt out of that. First of all, as I pointed out, this is intentional already with a neutrality point. But second of all, we think they are accessible for the reason that empirically there are many gay Christians and Muslims and many atheist people who are born in religious communities and vice versa. But beyond counterexamples, the structural reason is very simple. There is a great variance in the parts of the elements of a person's identity that become salient in the process of their life. There are obviously inputs into that process that does not constitute coercion. We think people freely opt in and in many instances. Additional to that is the fact that the churches often have an incentive to appeal to younger generations, which is not well helped by denouncing them all as gay or criticising the way they dress. They tell us there's propaganda and entrenchment, with the debating caricature of religions threatening people with fire and brimstone, and you will go to hell if you do not do X. If you have ever stepped inside a church, you will know that is false. The way you win trust and establish yourself as influence in a community is by having not criticising people from the day they are born, but rather by offering rituals and meanings and a sense of purpose that people come to value over the course of their lives. They tell us churches are poor at service delivery. We tell you that in fact churches are the most embedded organisation in a community, and they do not give a reason to say the state is any better. We think the state is worse. I'll give you the Aussie example of Centrelink, but whichever your welfare provision agency of your government is, ask people if they have a better time waiting on hold to get onto a counsellor with that service versus accessing an actual counsellor that was restrain religions rather than encourage the cracking down on that particular group. But also, it is possible for religions to find funding from worse sources, including corporations, which we think would be a more negative impact on religions and a more corrosive impact on the trust they have embedded in those communities. We think religion could be worse, but right now it's an institution worth supporting, and we can do that neutrally for many reasons unassociated with the arguments we've heard so far from the government bench. Very proud of it.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the member of government.
It seems like the upper house focused a lot on whether or not each religious organization can still provide as a public service provider or provide spiritual support. Inclusive government, we believe that what we are fighting for is not only the existence of such support, but also the quality of this support as well. And I'm going to talk about in our extension how exclusively, after ending all the state funding, how we can incentivize more competition within the market and thus by at the end improve the quality of services that religious organization is going to bring forward to the community. But before that, few points of rebuttal towards opening opposition. First of all, I think that opening opposition lives in a very ideal world in which at the beginning of the debate, they always say, okay, we're going to not allow the televangelism or to exist, and we're banning these religious organizations to actually use a liability shell. They completely ignore what the government bench has been consistently telling you, how there is an existing lack of check and balances, not only from the external market, but also uniquely from close to government. We believe that this lack of check and balances also come from within the hierarchical structure of these religious organizations. When these religious leaders perceive every attack or every challenges as an attack on their own faith or as an attack on doctrines, we think that this is how internal lack of check and balances make it harder for the progressive changes or all types of organic changes that opening opposition would like to fight for. Secondly, right, they talk about how I think in the deputy speeches. No, thank you. In the deputy speeches, they mention a lot about how these religious organizations provide a lot of spiritual support, how communities to the elderly. First of all, we are not denying the fact that religious organizations do have some contribution. However, the marginal benefit or the scenario that we provide to you coming from closing of government is that we don't see that tax breaks or the financial support from state is an entitlement to you as long as you are being the service provider. We would like these religious organizations to compete. Like we think that to compete based on the quality of services that they are providing. No. Therefore, we think that the benefits that they talk about is not mutually exclusive, but in my extension, uniquely, I'm going to talk about how their services that they are talking about community support or like being a public service provider, like education or supporting a healthcare system, can be better achieved on the outside. No, thank you. And moving on directly towards my extension, right? First of all, we think that what will happen after state end all the fundings, right? First of all, we think that for the big churches or the mega churches, we don't think that they will immediately die out because we think the existing network will still exist. However, we think that at the marginal benefit that our side will talk about, that we can bring forth is we will talk about those small and medium-sized firms, because right now we can provide an extra incentive for these churches to actually lobby for extra support. But even if worst case scenario, we think that these small and medium-sized churches really die outright. We think that religion in itself is a value system that is subjected to people whether or not they want it or they perceive this religion is important to them. We think it should be up to a democratic decision on whether or not that particular religion is important to them. No, thank you. Therefore, we think that what will happen after we end all the churches? We think that after we end all the financial support towards these churches, right? We think very likely private donation will be able to sustain their daily operation and also the services that they're providing. But what is the marginal? Well, how would the incentive change under our paradigm, right? So without state funding, right? We think that right now these religious organizations, regardless of you are big or small, you need to actively lobby and fight for more funding, right? We think it opens a chance or a door later after this. It opens a door or chance for these religious organizations to actually compete for more funding from not only from their own subscribers but also the lobbying in the public sphere as well. We think that this competition of faith is important. Why? Because right now, if these religious organizations know that they can no longer rely on the government support, which we don't think that they necessarily really need to, because even a lot of churches, they are really rich. But we think that this is how we can use this as a bargaining chip to actually incentivize these churches to actually improve the quality of services and to not only provide better schooling or better education towards the elderly and also towards the student, but more than that, before that closing.
In your world, the large established churches still have their billionaire donors. The small, progressive, democratic churches lose their funding from the state, which is often their only source of funding. How do you increase religious competition?
Well, we think that we agree. We don't think that it is not our burden to prove that all small and medium-sized churches will in one night suddenly become so powerful to compete with the churches. But right now, we think that competition will change. from their side. Will change from being a monopolistic competition under their paradigm towards a free market competition in which these small and medium-sized religion can actually compete. But even for said, even if they cannot really compete, right? We think it's actually fine because religion itself is should be subjected to people's demand of it. If people don't feel like they really need it, we think it's fine for it to die out as well. But more importantly, right, on my second extension, right, we think that opening government talk about how how religious organization is not a best actor to provide public services. We think that in closing government, we believe that when it comes to important sector like education or healthcare, we think that it is better for government to have a direct control or direct supervision of it, especially given to the context in which like a lot of churches, even though they claim that they're providing a lot of charities, I think that opening government has already characterized how these churches, how there's a lack of check and balances within the churches. We think that the funding that could have been given to these religious organizations could have now been used on government building more hospitals or building more schools. The nuance of these two actors conducting this policy is that for this religious organization, the moment when they try to build the churches, they are imposing a condition onto you. What is that condition? You can only enjoy the services only if you believe in my own religion, or only when you become my followers. However, we think that when it comes to the state is a more neutral actor that provides services to not only to subscribers but also to everyone who is in need of it. So based on all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon each member of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it is true that sometimes religion can be rigid, unaccepting, and discriminatory. It is also true that often it is progressive, democratic, and the only source of support in your community. We think the side proposition policy actually entrenches the power of conservative and discriminatory institutions and destroys the ability of small churches and small religious groups who want to advocate for progressivism to actually increase competition. Partly economics, but literally, Mr. Speaker, the state subsidy is the government stepping into a monopolistic market, which is the existing framework ideas in religion of large religious institutions, and helping small entrants to increase competition, something that we think that policy completely destroys. Firstly, why does this just destroy progressive evolution of religion, right? The first question to ask here is, when is religion bad? And we agree with the government side that often when it is unprogressive and hierarchical, when it's doctrinal and rigid in its doctrines, when it excludes minorities and often pushes for things which are discriminatory and don't accept the identities of a diverse group of people. We think large established institutions are far more likely to be prone to this kind of conservatism or lack of progressivism. Why? Firstly, because the large, for example, the Catholic Church has a demographic which is composed largely of existing older people who control power and capital in society and often are less resistant to change, meaning they have no incentive to do this. Secondly, because they already have a large existing base which is premised on preaching the existing doctrine, means it makes no sense for them to try and gain the marginal support, or like they could lose a large number of people. But third, because there are large bureaucracies, like any large corporation, the Catholic Church, to have one small change in its doctrine, for example, has to go through many layers of like discussions going up to the Vatican to actually try and change. What happens to these institutions under their policy? Because I don't think opening clash actually distinguishes the impact of this policy on different sizes of institutions. We think institutions like the Vatican Church, the Anglican Church, the Orthodox Church, or Saudi Arabia's control over the Sunni faith are marginally effective in this policy. Why is that? Firstly, because they already control a large amount of capital which is accumulated through hundreds of years of the monopoly that they've had over this religion and through the plunder of the treasuries of different countries they've been to, and the followers who've given them large amount of money. They have a large existing follower base means they can always tap on to get more money. They already have things like media wings, for example, control over politicians or lobbies, or have massive amount of support which already exists, meaning they're the least likely to be affected under their policy. Like the Catholic Church still continues to have its billionaire donors, right? Sheldon Adelson still continues to donate billions of dollars to the Jewish faith or established Jewish institutions in the United States. We think on the margin, these institutions are the ones which are least affected. So all your harms about like existing churches or the Catholic Church opposing abortion, for example, or the existing large religious institutions opposing LGBTQ people or accepting marriage for gay people still continues and is probably even worse now on the margin because these people are less likely to depend depend on state funding. We think that's a harm that is exacerbated under their paradigm. We do not think that their policy does anything to change the way in which these large institutions actually go through. Yes?
The Catholic Church is precisely changing because of the broader change in society and the amount of criticism that they might have. That doesn't happen in small congregations that don't care in the status quo and only care about religious doctrine.
Actually, I would posit the reason the Catholic Church is changing is because it is scared of losing followers to smaller churches who are prescribing a more progressive form of that faith. They are scared of losing people to smaller LGBTQ-friendly churches, for example, who more democratic people are going like, you know what, I'd rather subscribe to that. We think that is destroyed under your policy. How do we say this? What happens to the smaller religious institutions, right? And the first question to ask is, how are these smaller religious institutions conceived to begin with, right? An example, like from 100 years, few hundred years ago, is yet a few centuries ago now, the Shia faith, for example, which devolved from the Muslim faith because they had disagreements about the way the doctrine was preached, or the Protestant church, which often sprung up because they felt their ideas were incompatible with the Catholic Church. There are often cases in which democratic uprisings within large religious groups of people who disagree with the way in which the doctrine is prescribed lead to the formation of smaller new churches, which then can evolve into, as the example, the Protestant church or the Shia faith, into large followers of people, right? In the present world, for example, smaller churches coming up across the Western world which are homosexual and LGBTQ friendly, right? Or churches which say that your sexuality does not matter or don't prescribe forms of the biblical text which say that you should go to hell for being a certain kind of way. We think, or for example, thirdly, minority religions in countries which have dominant Christian populations, for example, like the smaller Muslim organizations trying to get funding in the US where a large amount of money is directed towards churches, for example, are people who depend on state funding to try and progress their ideas. What happens to them in their policy, Mr. Speaker? We think you destroy the ability of these people to gain access to or have any sort of progress. Why? Because they lose the essential money they get from the state to do simple things which are big outcomes. Things like renting a space to have the discussions in your community, or to print flyers and send them out to people, or for example, try and gain a Facebook page or hire a social media director to try and reach their message on Facebook, which has become a popular way of preaching these things to people, or creating safe spaces or hiring counselors for LGBTQ people in that community, Mr. Speaker. You destroy the ability of these small religious institutions who do not, or whose members cannot, or either are not accepted by the church or feel that their identities cannot be accepted in the large religious organizations in which they are born into, Mr. Speaker. You destroy the competition that closing government wants to talk to you about, right? Like this state subsidy is the only way in which you reduce the high barriers of entry that exist in status quo because of the monopoly the large institutions have to have this ability to have the ability of these people to create some sort of change. Like on a societal level, Mr. Speaker, you destroy the ability of religions to progress. Why? As I said, as replied by POI, often large institutions progress only when they're challenging their ideas and their membership by smaller institutions who then tend to get a following. We think large religious institutions are often resistant to change, especially from outsiders, which is why we think pressure from people who are not religious or not part of a denomination is less effective than smaller churches who are like conceived in your community and then challenge the existing dogma that is preached by the major preacher in your town or city. We think it is problematic that religion is then caught in the exact sort of conservatism and exclusion that they talked about. It's problematic both on an individual level because it destroys the ability of like people who were born to the Christian faith in like conservative America but suddenly lose like the ability to go to that church or find that counselor who's LGBTQ friendly or join that church where they aren't like excluded because of their sexuality. But on a societal level, you destroy the ability or the pressure on large churches, Mr. Speaker, or large religious institutions to change. We think it's highly unlikely that like for example, the Catholic Church's progression would have happened if you hadn't seen Christian people saying that we actually disagree with the way this doctrine is preached. You lose all those benefits on your side when you say that state funding should not be given to these people. Because state funding, Mr. Speaker, has differential impact depending on what size you are. And if it's true that the large institutions preach a form of religion which is dogmatic and problematic, you entrench that further with extremely proud reports.
I'd like to thank the speaker and call upon the government rep.
Ladies and gentlemen, essentially two questions in this debate. First of all, is religious organization a good actor to be funded? And second of all, whether it's good or bad for this kind of funding to the development of the religious itself. So all the responses will be integrated into our clashes. First of all, is religious organization a good actor to fund? OG, success, I think we need to discuss this question in 3 layers. First of all, accessibility to this kind of service being provided, and second of all, the quality of this kind of services, and lastly, whether it's a correct attitude to provide this kind of services, right? First of all, accessibility. The OG successfully tell us is that why religion is so exclusive, but apparently there's a lot of government funding or government policy exclusive. So, for example, scholarships, right? So apparently that's not the only reason why we should not fund that. But the problem is why government funding become a problem in religion is that when this kind of funding, the major target or the major objective for the government to fund this kind of religion is that they want this kind of religious, they expect this kind of religious to provide the most fundamental things to deliver, for example, shelter and food. When we think about this kind of fundamental necessary is being so explicit and selective, that's the problem of today's debate, right? Well, especially when they already told us, it's like how they also find this kind of religious being exclusive, being conservative from anyways, right? They need to tell us that why government have to pay such kind of agent being so selective and being so conservative to become the sole or the most major service provider when actually distributing the services, right? But second of all, it's about the quality of this kind of service being provided, right? First of all, as Florence already told you, has the lack of check and balance within the structure of this kind of religious organization, especially when most of the time, what kind of organization we're being funded is those kind of organization that is capable enough to provide enough services to the public, which means that apparently this kind of organization, mostly being so large and so hierarchical, is being highly alienated from different layers, right? Which means that for this specific group of organization, it's very unlikely for the government to actually put a check and balance on them, right? But second of all, it's also about having direct control of this kind of services, for example, like providing school or charity, but the government is a better choice instead. What they're trying to say is that, okay, because our kind of religious organization that trust for the people, and then people tend to like them more, right? First of all, I don't know why this kind of trust is that important in the government's eyes. But second of all, if that trust is a good thing, right? I think the government would like to collect this kind of trust for themselves rather than letting the trust going to someone else, right? We believe that it's also a way for the government to regain the reputations because when they actually provide this kind of service by the government, right? I think it's time for the government to actually control the quality and control and improve the check and balance and try to improve the reputation and trust for the government rather than letting it to begin outsources, right? The last is about how do we have actually an alternative to distribute this kind of resources. It's about whether we choose the correct actor, right? In our business is that first of all, in the most majority case, they will choose to fund those who is big enough to provide enough services, right? But even in that scenarios, they also first of all, apparently if they are big enough, first of all they already have the private donors, and also they actually have a lot of different ways to make money. For example, they own land, or for example they build school or whatnot, right? But apparently, so apparently they will not actually fund those people who are actually those kind of LGBT or a small religious. Apparently they're not going to be funded, right? I think it's quite naive for the OVO to say that we're just actually going to ensure the bar for this kind of religious organization to get the funding would be fair or whatnot, right? Apparently, according to first, because of the limited resources, and second of all, because of these kind of government are democratic enough, which means that they're going to specifically choose the religious organization that attempt to somehow fit into the mainstream ideology or somehow can better represent the majority religious belief, right? Which means that it's going to be exclusive under their scenario. They characterize how democratic state are, right? So what's your point?
Do you agree with funding the arts, as my deputy asks, or do you agree that funding shouldn't be based on subjective doctrinal interpretation of some religions, particularly in a context where, as we tell you, almost all religions do a large amount of charitable and social good?
So first of all, on the first layer, is that apparently, if that, first of all, as we just mentioned, right, there's a lot of funding or policy exclusive, but then, for example, like scholarship. But this kind of scholarship or or for example, like public house, or for example, like some sort of like scholarship or whatnot, they're not essential for the living food of this kind of like of citizens, right? But apparently the service that you were talking about, for example, shelter, food, or spiritual support, if you agree that they're still essential or that's still very important for the citizens, right? This should not be exclusive, right? That's exactly the answer, right? Let's move on to the second question. Like, can this kind of funding, can this kind of funding be distributed equally or fairly, right? First of all, let's say they will ensure the bar is going to be the same for both a big or a small religions. Apparently, that's not the case, as I just already told you, right? But unfortunately, the purpose of the CO cases is that they want to say that this kind of, for example, this kind of like uprising small religious, they want them to be fun because that's the only source for them to get money or whatnot. They want them to be more exclusive. They want them to be more inclusive, right? But first of all, we're not quite sure why the government has some kind of incentive to embrace such kind of ideology to begin with. But even if that is the case, right, we say that it's not going to be happening, right? First of all, it's because if you are because first of all, having government funding equals to having more government interventions and government losing autonomy as a religious, right? So apparently, if you actually having this kind of funding for this kind of like religious that support LGBT or support for more inclusiveness, apparently they will have just losing your autonomy at the end of the day, right? But second of all, it's also about even if you are sponsoring this subsidizing this kind of small religious, right? But eventually you're also sponsoring a lot of the largest, for example, the Christian or the most conservative one in the society, right? Because eventually this kind of like predominant or like the traditionally like strong like conservative religious is still gonna be expressing their influence to the citizens anyway. Right? So we're not quite sure how under their side of the house this kind of small religions is gonna be better off, right? But under our cases, as response cultures, like we want to try to eliminate this kind of bar to begin with, right? It's just that we're not gonna ensure to you why all of a sudden we're having a law that to ban monopoly just to ensure all small firms to begin rich at the end of the day. But as a government, as a responsible government, what we need to do is that we try our best to eliminate the possibility for this kind of big group to become even bigger and bigger. Right? I mean, that's exactly the point. So we know it's not our burden to tell you why without this kind of government funding, this kind of small or new regions is going to be better. But at least we're trying to ensure that a fair platform to develop. So for the reason we are opposed.
Thank you, speaker, and call upon
I must say this kind of a bold move and whip to not only not respond at all to the extension that has been presented in the speech before you, but also abandon any pretense of defending the extension that their own speaker gave. Because that approach is very similar to the approach of the government bench today to the problem of religion in today's society, which is you cannot wish it away. You cannot wish away the existence of the Catholic Church and its decades and centuries of resource accumulation and accumulation of power and importance in the minds of people. Because the truth is, Adela's analysis is entirely correct. Religion has a monopoly on solace, on community, on moral guidance, on many of the sorts of things that the biggest religious institutions are most able to weaponize and to control in our society. The question in this debate is how should the state engage with them? Tax policy, importantly, is not just a lever to collect revenues, or to think about whether an individual tax is individually justified, I don't know, because like the person being taxed owes a reciprocal duty to the state and all that stuff. That stuff is important, but what is also important and true is that tax policy is one of the only ways in which the state influences behavior writ large. That in order to get a behavior you want, you impose a tax or subsidy here and there. And that is the way in which we should think about tax policy or the funding or the tax benefits that religion gets in society in this debate. In this, I want to deal with some of the questions that the government bench kind of raises to us with regards to taxes. Firstly, the main attack here, I think, is the claim that tax benefits and financial benefits cannot be used for services that are excludable. I think Aditya correctly points out that it is trivially true that this happens in the status quo and it's not disputed. Say, for example, the use of tax policy to fund AA scholarships for minorities to universities seems to be a thing that we all find quite controversial. Later, they then say, no. The important thing here is that you cannot deny people necessary services via taxes that are excludable. But I don't think it's at all true that government bench finds these services to be necessary. If it were, cheaper, then you would in fact fund the further provision of these services.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, I don't think that religious solace fits the kind of secular notion of what is necessary under their own test. So the final test they have is, well, we have to be able to hold them to account. This is true, but you guys have no way of holding them to account because the Catholic Church continues to exist and does whatever it wants to do with its millions of followers across the world. So what is the best way to use tax policy to create a world where these religions can be held to account? We think the mechanism is competition and change from within, competition from people being able to select their own religion or develop their own denominations, and that's what Aditya tells you provided more on that later in my speech. Before I go on to that bulk of extending on Aditya's material, I want to talk about one extraneous rebuttal, which is this notion that some religions have too much power and therefore the state unequally funds them. That is bad. One, that does not seem to be our burden to this debate to defend the unequal funding of religions. But two, know that this is empirically false in most secular countries, which is to say, the sort of financial benefits that religions receive in a state like the United States or even a state like China is either like everyone gets nothing or everyone gets tax exemption and so on and so forth. I think it's quite unclear in this debate why we have to defend like literally state-sanctioned religions of theocracies like Iran. I don't think that's part of the debate, and I don't think therefore this is a powerful claim. The central question in this debate then is how do we engage in the with the monopolistic market that is a religious space controlled by institutions like the Catholic Church. Note that one thing they say here is that state endorsement is damaging when like the state is seen to endorse religious practices. Again, note that this is more true in a world where the relative power of these big and small religious institutions is deepened by their model. So again, that's something that this model material deals with. What is this material that I responded to before I go on to that? Yes.
If your premise is that society flocks to more inclusive institutions, true, it doesn't depend on there being funding, but it depends on value changes in the society. So the donor base is the comparatively unchanged. The only thing that changes is more incentives for those small institutions to change.
No. You are correct that it does depend on the change in society. We think the change in society is happening, but most importantly, that change in society is only relevant when there are donations past the mark that is needed to set up a church, past the barriers of entry that are needed to set up a meaningfully sized denomination that can begin to be firstly meaningful competition with the powerful institutions like the Catholic Church, and secondly create a sort of doctrinal competition that leads to change from within. What does Aditya tell you? Firstly, he establishes the premise that major religious institutions remain. Truly, this is true. They have more money, they have vast reserves, richer donors, and they can sustain the sunk cost of entry that crucially smaller denominations cannot. At the point at which these small churches lose these sort of tax benefits that are granted to them, they don't have the alternative sources of revenue or the centuries of reserves of capital that Mitra mentions and describes that powerful institutions like the Catholic Church or the Church of England and so on and so forth have. Two things are true of these churches. Firstly, they're the most hierarchical and the most conservative to the extent to which we acknowledge that these are often the worst harms of religions and churches in this world. These are most true of the biggest churches. They are the ones who are most often seen in the news perpetuating instances of coercion or things like the child abuse scandal, and they're the least likely to change these things because they're the most hidebound by their practices, they're the most risk averse, they're the most bureaucratic. Note that the ability to reform from within these churches is small, because for individual followers to say, I do not want this anymore and I want to speak up against it, means that they challenge the weight of an entire bureaucracy and hierarchy which has been built upon centuries. But note also that the ability to threaten a change from within is tiny, not because it is difficult to doctrinally challenge these institutions, but because they have no chance to threaten exit. That is not true in a world where small churches can continue to exist. One thing we should note here is that many religions are engaged in competition to survive in a world that is secularizing and where people turn away from religion. This means that often they are not competing to proselytize to people who are not spiritual or not likely to believe in religion, but people who are often spiritual, but looking at which church best fits their personal practices and personal beliefs, as these guys point out, in a world where practices are increasingly incompatible with what is written in the book. But that often happens from below. For example, the reform in the Catholic Church that we see, loosening of attitudes towards contraception, does not happen because the Catholic Church individually has decided this. It happens because dioceses in countries like continents like Latin America or countries like the Philippines and across Africa recognize that this is an important thing that they need in the present day. Small denominations are what offer people these choices and which can be more flexible to evolve to the changing needs of people in a changing world. The existence of these small churches then creates pressure on larger churches to change their practices and change their beliefs. It also creates a degree of doctrinal dialogue between these churches. They are more able to reinterpret the book in ways that larger churches are unwilling to do so. Know that these things can only happen in a world where the state subsidizes or gives tax benefits to small churches. That is why our side must be the side that wins this debate.
I'd like to invite people to wait outside, and I will try and debate this myself and see who ends up winning that sweat. Thank you everyone for what was a very interesting debate, very good one. I think at some points it was a debate that covered a ton of material and a ton of areas. In some ways, I think that part of the problem with that, it made it somewhat hard to figure out, for me at least, where some of the positions was that there tended to be a disagreement in terms of where this motion is. As we start with a motion about state funding of religion, without sort of a limited definition in terms of where states are, where this necessarily applies. And by the end of the debate, we're still in one of the whip speeches, having a bit of a discussion on this clearly is not our burden to defend necessarily state religious states or states that are biased, like for instance Iran. And my thought in my head is, look, this is a statement that probably most people in this round agree with. It's also a statement that is debatable to some degree. I mean, I think you probably could make arguments in this debate that the idea of religion as a whole being a divisive and coercive force and things like that, and that Iran is an example of that, or as a force for evil in the world on net or whatever. And the third thing I'm thinking of is, well, this may very well be debatable. It's not really something that was debated in the round. People basically made assumptions on it. And I think one of the big things in this debate was there was a high degree of assertiveness on it. Now, I don't think, and by this I don't mean assertiveness purely in terms of argument, because I think that happens in every debate when people make arguments or do examples and move on. But I think a lot of people made assertions about what had happened in the debate or who had won earlier clashes, and then proceeded to base their entire strategies about it, such that everyone assumed that the round had now become solely about service provision, or it becomes solely about which religious groups you necessarily wanted to do, or it became about whether or not religions get more money or not in terms of it, but without necessarily ensuring whether or not all the work had been done to say that we're going to do it. And the result was the number of teams clashed with one or two other teams in the debate, or perhaps not with an additional team elsewhere in the round, which therefore meant that in a lot of cases, while teams won, and I think every team here won some degree of the clash they set up, I think that there was less work in terms of trying to figure out why the clashes that people chose to fight on ended up being the most important clashes in the debate. And I'm going to run through that in more detail and more specific as I go through and give the call on that. Ultimately, I ended up giving the win to the team in opening government. After about 7 minutes of pacing back and forth on this and basically going heavily over my notes, I narrowly gave the second to the team in opening opposition, and the third to the team in closing opposition, and the fourth, unfortunately, to the team in closing government. Now, I think that what opening government does here is they do three things, one of which I think that they do perhaps not as well as they could, one of which they do well, and then the third thing here is that they get lucky in terms of the way this round develops, such that the thing that they do very well ends up being significantly more important in the grand scheme of things than the thing they don't. I think that the thing that perhaps is not done as well as possible is the model setup. And I think in some ways that is, that when you go up and you say, we're going to eliminate all state funding of religion, this very quickly becomes something that's pointed out by the opening opposition, where they say, what does this mean? And the fact that we're talking about the difference between, say, whether or not these are certain states like Iran, or are we simply doing it with tax their status, is something that, being undefined, places you in a somewhat weakened position for pragmatics. Because in some cases, it's hard to win efficiency-based impacts if it's unclear what precisely we're trying to do and the mechanism we're using for that in terms of it. And I think in some cases, expanding on this is there. Now that said, I don't think you're necessarily having to do purely tax-exempt status or simply charities. I think, for instance, education, which gets brought up briefly by closing government, is a huge thing. Definitely, I know in the United States, but a lot of countries, is do you want to fund private religious schools? It's a long-term issue in the UK of do you fund Catholic ones elsewhere? Especially issue if the government schools are at least nominally religious in terms of minority rights. And I think one of the key things, and I'll come back to this when I'm discussing the comparative for opening opposition, is I think this is one of the first places you'll see a tendency in this round, which is a correct challenge is made. The challenge, insofar as it exists, is substantiated, but then it isn't exploited, perhaps to the great degree it can to sort of impact it. The net result, though, is that that leaves in place the rest of the case, which is a fairly philosophical one. And this is one in which you define the clash. And I think one of the most important things in the debate is figuring out what you want to achieve. Is this a debate where the problem here is that religions are inefficient actors in terms of running charities? Is the issue is that is this a clash between religion versus no religion? We prefer a world without it. Is the issue here unequal funding of religion, which could be simply remedied by equally funding all religions? Is the situation that the wrong religions exist, in which case we wouldn't want to do biased funding, or we'd want to use the government to manipulate things such that certain religions prevail over others? Is it an issue of we actually think the religions would do a better job in terms of funding and therefore better job in efficiency if they were left and they're sort of being put by government welfare into being less efficient? And I think that in some ways you run a case that engages with the most of these because you have the clearest idea of what you want, and what you believe here is that religion is bad. Religion is bad not necessarily because it is sort of a thing that is inefficient or that you don't like religious charities. It is that you feel that it's coercive. You feel that the act of someone going up and saying that, God, that you're going to hell if you disagree is a coercive thing. And for me, this is a differentiation from everything else in the debate in the sense that we get arguments here that there are other people who say that being gay is wrong or advocate policies we don't like on abortion. We have other people here who tell you in terms of what schools or we're only going to fund certain groups of people, or we're going to have funding that only affects some groups or not others, or that only some parts of the population get. But what you're saying here is that the reason you're doing it is because of God. You can't engage with that. And for people who are within religions, that has a massively internalizing effect, which we hear is worse, for instance, for LGBT individuals. Not that people are opposing them, but that people are opposing them on the basis and saying there is nothing to appeal, especially if you have internalized it. But secondly, that it's bad for dialogue between it, especially between religious groups, because there isn't much of a potential for it. And when this is tied into the idea of minority-majority stuff, which is if you fund all religions equally, you inherently will end up reinforcing the existing majority structure unless you're engaging with a bias thing. And opening opposition chooses not to ultimately, they choose to argue that on a basis of legitimacy, we shouldn't be biasing against religions because we don't like their politics, which to a degree is not that challenge, is a legitimate challenge, and we'll go into this, but it doesn't really establish why legitimacy is a thing to be deciding on the debate if it's actually causing significant social harms. I think that and over here we have the issue is their preference is no religion at all, and that it will naturally do it simply because if you fund everyone, you're going to end up reinforcing majority things, and their goal is to have and end up doing a reduction on religion. And what that ends up doing is leaving you with harms that are basically staying throughout the round and work against the other clashes. Now, this is not saying that they're not rebuttable. In a lot of cases, I think that they become substantiated a lot more and clearer in the second speech. I think a lot of it is that people choose to engage very heavily, especially in opening opposition, with what you don't do in terms of defining what specific mechanisms are there, but then choose not to engage to a large degree in terms of what you do, which is the unique nature of religion. And to the extent to which there is engagement, which is when opening opposition talks about how it's illegitimate to do it, we don't get why legitimacy should be the basis for government policy if there's pragmatic harms. And especially when a lot of the clash that follows is a long list of pragmatic impacts about efficiency. it really then, it's possible for people to say, you know, maybe the government shouldn't be deciding we prefer a world in which there isn't religion. But you guys are saying why you don't like religion, why you think that this will lead to there being less of it, and why if it does, you think that's a good thing, and even if it doesn't, it's principally justified. And we're not getting a why choosing to try and manipulate the religious views of the people is a major harm, other than the suggestion that it's illegitimate to do so for political reasons, leaving that to a large degree to stand. And I think that in that sense, that you end up standing on your most important material. That said, I think you probably, to a large degree, lose on the argument that religious charities do not provide an efficiency bonus, perhaps to some degree over the state thing. I think that ultimately what ends up happening is that that's neither establishes the most important battle, but nor is the stuff that ends up coming in to hit it basically where the focus goes, and you end up to a degree sliding through on that. I think in a sense, in terms of comparison with closing government, I think that what you're ending up doing is giving a clear vision in terms of where you're not wanting the religion to be, and saying that those are the unique harms on it. And I think at the point at which there, even if you get a gain to efficiency on this, I think that you're saying that we don't care as much about that as we care about the internalization and having a dialogue in the political sphere of absolutism. And I think in that sense that even if CG is going to win on proving that you get slightly more money into it, well, one, I think there's, which we can come to little, there's a little bit of an implicit tension there. But secondly, I think that even prevailing on that and proving that this is more efficient is probably less important than the stuff on which OG prevails over OO on it, especially because I'm not sure you necessarily prevail on the efficiency stuff, and actually I probably need to say you probably don't, against opening opposition. I think this also comes down to, in terms of where necessarily the goals are, which is, do we want liberalism through supporting a more pluralistic religion, or do we believe that any religion in which God says it is good? And I think the implication here, which is definitely something that could be developed more, and maybe something we're into, is that even if you are, to some degree, doing it, the preference here, they believe, is it's coercive for you to say God does it. So it is coercive as well for God to be saying, they'd rather God be saying to a degree that they prefer there to be LGBT equality, but they prefer people were not saying God said this is the reason why. They prefer people were making secular other arguments, especially because people are not necessarily opting in. And in that sense, while you might win that this is a preferable thing, I think what you have to establish is they have no chance of success. Now, I think what you do is that this will strengthen conservative groups, but not necessarily why their general attack on the view of religion, which is, we as a state don't think religion is healthy. We think this is an inherently coercive thing, is there. And I think in that sense, you attack them, or what you in effect do is you rebut the debate of what is the most efficient way to promote the religions we like, which is sort of what opening opposition accuses them of doing. But you don't necessarily include secularism or e-religion as an option, which I think they do, or explain why it's not a viable option, which I think is, there's implicit stuff there that could be done and could be significantly elaborated that I think gets touched upon, which is, I think we see this in the whip a little bit with the engagement that we end up seeing about the idea that religions compete with each other. They're not really going after secular. There isn't really much interaction between the secular world and religions. It's mostly between religions. But I think that that isn't quite aimed at that. And I think that if you establish secularism can't work, so all you're going to be doing is sorting around people within religions. And consequently, because you're only going to be sorting, the net effect of their policy will be to sort them in the wrong ways. Then here's our extension. And I think then what you're doing is going to be taking it. And I will get when I'm going over to OO, I will do a little bit more on the op bench. And I think ultimately that ends up having you sort of go through audit. And I think that in a lot of ways, I think that you win because you go with the broadest approach, which is saying we don't like religion. And we don't think the state should be funding religion because we don't like religion. Now, we might prefer some versions of religions to others, but ultimately there. And I think that gives you a clear objective in this debate. I think the greatest weakness here for opening opposition is the lack of a clear objective as to what you're trying to do in this debate and what you're trying to achieve. I think the objective you have is will probably try and be sort of the government case you're getting. But I think in terms of the type of world you're wanting, you seem to spend a lot of time negating and saying why we shouldn't be able to do things and why this will be more efficient. And you end up proving a huge amount of stuff to be true without necessarily arguing why it being true wins. And I think this is unfortunate because I think there's actually a very, very good challenge at the beginning of the LO speech to the lack of a clear framework. I think there is a framework and a good justification for what is a viable view of the debate. I think the problem is that weaponizing what you're doing then doesn't really necessarily happen. The step we get to this is the argument that it's illegitimate for the government to be saying we dislike things because we dislike the politics. And I think that this is where you say it's illegitimate. Their clear complaints here are that it's inherently conservative. Now, I think part of their complaint is it's coercive, but in practice it ends up being conservative. But let's take it, because I think that is a legitimate challenge. I think it has a ton of stuff to go. But the problem is we don't have a big argument here about legitimacy and why states should not be necessarily playing favorites. The engagement we get is, and by analogy, which is we do this in other cases like arts and other stuff, without seeming to be endorsing specific things, which is the response to the majority. Which may or may not be the case, but isn't necessarily a case of these things being good things that we should do. There's no affirmative case for why art is necessarily good if they were wanting to engage with that, or why necessarily. It is, we already do this, therefore it must be legitimate. And I think that there's a lot of places you could go with this legitimacy in terms of government should not be socially trying to micromanage their populations, especially in democracies, where you're supposed to be representing the community. Because who ends up being excluded? Their entire concern here is exclusion, if you will. And especially for like their minority religious communities, if the government's going to say we don't like your beliefs, therefore we're going to delegitimize them, I think there's a huge thing there. And I think especially when those beliefs overlap with politics, there's a lot of stuff to do. But the problem is I think what you establish is say this is illegitimate. I'm inclined to agree it probably is illegitimate. But you don't say why being illegitimate is important, and therefore it is a reason why we shouldn't do this if they manage to actually reduce the number of religions here. And even if they reduce the total amount of, say, charitable giving, but they end up greatly reducing the number of religious people, and therefore the people being coerced in the religious environments and churches, why I should side with you on that trade-off. And I think that in some ways you actually reinforce where that clash is going because you spend a huge amount of time explaining why religions are actually beneficial middlemen in terms of the community, why they're very good distributors in terms of welfare, and why people will be harmed by their disappearance. And I think a lot of this, this probably wins over them in terms of efficiency. And by the end, you convince me that religious charities probably add an efficiency value. And eliminating them to probably to some degree would necessarily lose them. But I'm unconvinced the government's duty in this debate is to opt for the most efficient welfare distribution network. I can accept the government's duty is to be the most efficient, but if there's competing efficiency in terms of the society as a whole versus that, then it's unclear why the winning on the welfare efficiency is winning in the debate as a whole. And for that reason, and because you don't necessarily weaponize the efficiency stuff, I'm inclined to sort of place you behind them, despite the fact that I think on the stuff that you do choose to engage, whether it be at the beginning of the LO speech, in terms of the setup and how you envision the debate, or it be in terms of the efficiency on welfare and where you think this is going to go, or in the POIs and stuff, I actually think you tend to win most of the battles you choose to fight. I just think you may have wanted to choose to fight some additional ones or explain why those are the battles that are necessarily winning. I think that what that ultimately does, though, is that it ultimately places you in a good position for two reasons. One, because I think you do end up winning on the efficiency. And secondly, I think that people choose to pursue that. I think CG chooses to engage with you largely in terms of efficiency, in terms of money. And I think that this creates, I think that I think in some ways you've already dealt with this, One, by arguing, because they get up here and say, we might even get more donors. But you've already told us why the type of donors they're going to take are going to be taking advantage of people, because they have an inelastic market of donors who exist. And therefore, necessarily, them getting more donations out of their believers may not be a good thing for that. In which I think probably by itself, and I think there's other material and a ton of other, but I think even by that, I'm not sure the challenge we get here is sufficient, because I'm not sure that's ever engaged with. And at the point at which they've told us that religion's squeezing their donors for more, the actual downsides, the people they're taking money from, might outweigh the benefits of what they do with that money. I'm not sure we necessarily get a credible response, which I think puts you guys behind that. I think there's also an argument that that would not necessarily go to the right people. I think the second thing that you're doing on that, in terms of winning on the efficiency stuff, is that the thing that we are left with then is to weigh up the stuff that you engage with there in terms of the efficiency versus their argument here and their extension, which is we think that this would actually backfire in terms of liberalizing by reinforcing the groups of religions we're not wanting. And I think ultimately the problem with that I think they have to do is they need to challenge and take down the secularism thing as a viable alternative in order for that to be the comparative. And if they establish that's comparative, I think that probably would have placed them ahead of you and potentially ahead of OG, but I'm not sure that's ever established why that there's a dichotomy between those two choices. And to the extent it is, it's reliant on a lot of the analysis at the beginning of the LO in terms of framing the debate. And because of that, my inclination at the end is to feel that you win on your material and your material stands to a degree more on its own, even though you probably could have made it round winning with a bit more framing on that. And for that reason, my inclination is to put you ahead of both CO in addition to CG, but behind OG. For CG, I think I gave a bit of reasons on that. But basically, what I think you end up doing here is you choose to find this as to whether or not religions will get more or less money from this debate. And I think the problem with it is this debate is about whether or not religions having money generally is a good or desirable thing. To the extent to which you're doing it, you've basically, and this is where I was saying I think there's a problem with sort of assertiveness, is I think you make an assumption here that the debate here is whether or not allowing charities to receive government money for the distribution of welfare services is a net benefit, because what is the most efficient thing for welfare distribution? And therefore you very rapidly go into, we think religions may get more money on this. But I think the problem with this is they've already given us, like I mentioned, a reason why the people they're going to squeeze for in their fundraising processes are inherently harmful, and we don't want them to do it because we'd actually rather they get money from the state rather than squeezing their believers. But I think we also have the problem that comes up from CO, which is, I think what they say is that in effect the people who have the most access to it are the established religions, which tend to be doing conservative stuff in the views that they're necessarily wanting. And I think that they say that this gives a lot of power to people like Sheldon Adelson or the Catholic Church. And at that point, I think you have to respond. Now, I think to some degree you can respond and say that a lot of those things have very well organized welfare things and we're willing to buy that harm. And I think you could do it. But I think that, now I think that it's not so much that you don't respond at all, but I think there is something to be said there, that you're not necessarily responding as to why what they claim is a harm in their extension isn't a harm. And I do think that this is a problem because it does implicitly clash with your material, in that your material isn't mutually exclusive with it. And therefore, for your material to sort of be weaponized to take them down, you therefore need to deal with why it's not a problem for this to reinforce the positions of certain churches and certain religions to the exclusion of other religions. Because if that is a problem, then yes, maybe it's correct that if you take off government funding, they'll find more creative ways to do this, and they'll be finding more efficient ones, but then there'll be the other effects they mentioned, that this will reinforce the Catholic Church and conservative ones and lead to less pluralism on it. And like I said, I think that the degree to which the pluralism thing is determined as is basis established as the most important thing is not unassailable. And I think you could have hit that more strongly, but I'm not sure you necessarily do. I think also you need to deal, I realize it comes up a bit late, But I think at the point at which they've said that there's serious problems with the way in which they do private fundraising, we prefer them to get money from the state. And you're saying, well, we're going to basically engage and say that we think the only reason the state is relevant here is to the extent to which whether or not they get more money or not, therefore if they get more money without the state. I think you have to deal with that. I think there's also a wider thing here that is most serious, I think, for the two of you, but is applied elsewhere, which is religion versus religions, which is, I think, in some ways they're used interchangeably, which is religion on net versus religion. Basically, are we indifferent as to where? Because a lot of things in this debate will help some groups and hurt others, and I think that the two of you, probably to the most extreme extent in this round, but by no means are you the only team that does this, get very, very focused on the idea of let's aggregate all the religious groups in the country, aggregate their total amount of money, and then ask, is this increased or decreased? And I think that you need to ask yourself, especially when opening government at the very beginning, basically makes a discrepancy between majority religions and things like that, and says it's inherent to any country that's pluralistic simply based on numbers. I think there is more that needs to be done on that for us to assume that religions having more money on net is the best thing that could happen in this debate. I think for CO, you probably heard a bit on this. Like I said, I had a lot of trouble with the op actually because I think that if basically managed to establish this round is about what is the most efficient means to get the most liberal religions or maximize the influence of liberal religions versus conservative religions, you arguably probably not just accept that you probably win this debate. I think where you come in on this is establishing that that is in fact the debate or it is the most important clash that we are having. That means basically eliminating the alternative option that OG is floating of basically secularism or reducing the influence of religions on this. It also means, and I don't think it's necessarily a die thing or an absolute thing on all, but it means probably finessing at least a little bit the issue we're opening opposition is saying we don't think it's legitimate for us to play God with religious views based on us preferencing some of your views or not. You may want to talk about that in terms of legitimacy or saying that I think one of the other things in this round that never really gets discussed, that very much could come out here, is what is the role of the state? What is the state's duty to society? Because we hear legitimacy over here, which state should not be doing this. We hear the state should be doing this. What is the state's role? Because the state's role is to try and maximize the interest of society or do things that state favors. You can very easily move it from things the state favors to, I think, the state favoring these more liberal progressive religions. And say the worst thing the state could do in terms of influence is cut off its funding and thereby destroy that influence from the views it does. The state can obviously choose to promote the views it wants, and that's something we can have a debate about. But whatever views we want to promote, we probably would like those views to be spread more widely. This is why that will happen under our side. And basically, I think with that framing and that sort of impact on it, and you establish it as a clash, your extension, which I think in some ways is the best analyzed stuff in this debate in terms of cause, effect, multi-step process, this is what's going to happen, this is why it's going to do, probably then prevails and moves you up significantly here. I think without that, the question is, assuming you prevail on this, is this the best possible outcome and is this the reason why we should adopt that policy? I think that said, there is a little bit of some of the assertiveness that there's elsewhere. I think that you're a bit quick to announce consensuses by analogy. I think it's one of the first times I've heard the Shia-Sunni split as being defined as a triumph of democracy. I think there were some Iranian writers in the 70s who did that briefly. But I think there's also an example you do where everyone here agrees and accepts the idea that we are going to do affirmative action scholarships for things. Now, I think there's stuff to be developed there, but you then move on just by giving that as an example and then proceed to base arguments on it without developing it. I'm not 100% sure that's a universal consensus everywhere that doesn't have any degree of controversy that no one would disagree with. And when you're using it as an example of consensus and then predicating arguments subsequently, I think that there's a little bit of using examples to establish and then basing then saying that because we prove something with the example, we're going to run a lot more developed and analyzed arguments afterwards. And I think that's the effect perhaps diminishing the impacts of the very, very well-developed and well-analyzed arguments that follow on after that. I'm sorry if I'm holding you here excessively with that. Feel perfectly free to ask any questions you're wanting on that. I'm hoping this was helpful on that. And sorry if that came off a little bit 20-degree disjumbled. I did not want to sort of go through and basically give every team in terms of where they were clashing with others, because I think there were multiple points of clash on this. And like I said, I think that the big problem was not so much winning the fights that people set up. I think both op teams won the debates they decided to debate. I think it was establishing why those were the debates, and winning those things meant that you guys won the debate.
Thank you.
And that proved why the state treated fund religion. Or should.